Levinas himself says, and I think he's correct, that Western philosophy has been primarily interested in knowledge. It really began as a scientific project. The first natural scientists were the Greeks. Aristotle really sets up the sciences, physics, biology. Nevertheless, there has been another tradition within philosophy, probably going back to Socrates, who says the question of discovering what is the good is really the primary question. Not to know the true, but to know the good. In his case, it was to know the true about the good, being a philosopher. And this commitment to science distinguished philosophy from a mythological consciousness, from a theatrical consciousness, literary theatrical consciousness. It really marked the beginning of science, which has now, it's not even Western, it's global. So for Socrates to care more about the good, he said it's more important, because he had originally studied science, natural science. He said, what I really want to know about is not, how rocks are constituted or how far the stars are or what their significance is, but what is piety? How can I be a pious person? What is goodness? How can I be a good person? What is justice? How can we have a just state? That is, he was asking the questions that require debate, deliberation, conversation, rather than empirical research or demonstrable truth. There are sort of three avenues to truth. Demonstrations, A implies B, B implies C, A implies C, or empirical science, let's do the research, go to the laboratory, or for the most important questions, as Socrates saw them, let's discuss it, let's debate, let's propose ideas, and let's see how they come out, and I'll follow the best ones. Nevertheless, philosophy pursued, for the most part, the science project. The first, or I should say, one of the greatest philosophers of all time, I think everyone would admit this, it seems to me, he's the culmination of classical philosophy, the fulfillment and culmination of classical philosophy is Emmanuel Kant, who wrote a critique of knowledge and a critique of ethics and a critique of aesthetics. These three books are monuments in Western rationality and who we are as people. He was an Enlightenment thinker. But Kant does something peculiar. He insists that practical reason, which was his term for ethics, has primacy over knowledge. So although he made his fame and people consider his greatest work, his critique of science, his understanding of what science is, that understanding led him to see that ethics comes first, care for others, doing the good, finding a just society. Now, after Kant, when I say he was the culmination of philosophy, he was really the culmination of a philosophy that began with dualistic premises that probably the Greeks inherited from the Persians, which probably came from India. These are pretty standard assumptions in the ancient world, that the soul is separate from the body, that the mind is separate from the body. These dualisms, now they cause insuperable problems for thought, for coming to an adequate understanding of how things really are. They are, you could say, theological prejudices that come from our ancient past. Not to say there's no soul, but to think of the soul as separate from the world, as somehow detached from this space and time world that we know of. So Kant was the culmination of that kind of thinking, but therefore he was limited by that kind of thinking. So when he thought of freedom in terms of ethical freedom, he thought of it as a pure freedom, an unmotivated freedom, a freedom completely detached from the causality of the natural world. Because he couldn't figure out how can you have a freedom that's connected to the causality of the natural world. But the reason he had that problem is he thought of the natural world in terms of causality. So if you think of the world in terms of causality, the only way you can have freedom is to separate it from that causal sequence. Otherwise, we're not free. So the commitment to ethics, but the commitment to dualism. So with Kant, this commitment to dualism ends. The rest of philosophy will attempt to overcome those dualisms. It'll try a variety of ways. Hegel will say, history is the meeting of spirit and matter. Schelling goes and says, it's really, you have to start with the imagination, not with knowledge, not with freedom, but with the imagination. And that was the third critique of Kant was on the imagination. The major trends of contemporary or modern philosophy after Kant have followed Schelling. Imagination is the route away from these dualisms. So Nietzsche, for instance, has an aesthetic philosophy, the philosophy of the artist, because imagination is the core of his thought. Bergson, too, makes imagination the center. Heidegger, absolutely. Husserl reverts back to making science primary, but the main thrust has been those who say, let's stick with science, and those who say we have to overcome the dualisms by recognizing the centrality of imagination. Levinas is the first philosopher at the highest rung of philosophy, that is, a genius, really, who takes the Kantian position that ethics is primary, that ethics is first philosophy. What makes him so important then is that he has freed himself of the dualistic epistemology that governs Kant. He's a phenomenologist. He was a student of Husserl, a student of Heidegger. Phenomenology gave him the tools to speak about the world without this dichotomization, this dyadic soul, body, mind, matter. So he begins with an integral picture of how things are, and on that basis grounds the primacy of ethics. And he's really the first philosopher to do that. He's still exceptional in that way.